So, good morning, afternoon, and evening to all. I would like to welcome all our speakers and participants for another exciting webinar within the series on accelerating cross-border paperless trade facilitation. This time it is co-led by UNCITRAL and as usual organized by ESCAP-ICC and ADB. UNCITRAL is one of the lead organizations focusing their efforts to support and overcome challenges related to the legal aspects of cross-border paperless trade. Therefore, I would like to thank you, Mr. Luca Castellani, who has supported the organization of this webinar and joined us for the panel session. We have on board excellent and experienced speakers with diversified background in the area of the legal issues relevant for the international trade. And I trust we are going to have very interesting discussion on how to solve challenges related to the data and flow of information, which can be, let's say, metaphorically or rightfully mentioned as the blood of the cross-border paperless trade. Now, I would like to introduce speakers for the opening remarks and start with the pre-recorded message from Jan Duval, Chief Trade Policy and Facilitation Section, Trade Investment and Innovation Division. Next, we'll be speaking Ms. Atita Komindir, who I would like to express thank you that she joined us live as well. And of course, she's the head of the UNCITRAL Regional Center for Asia and Pacific. After, we will have two pre-recorded interventions from Ms. Anna Nguyen, Director of Digital Ecosystems, lead on the Digital Standards Initiative from ICC. And last but not least, Mr. Kijun Kim, Senior Economist from ADB, who is experienced in trade facilitation, trade finance in the context of the region, Asia Pacific. So without further ado, please, Vanarat, please launch the message from Jan Duval. Thank you.
So on behalf of UNESCAP, a very warm welcome to all participants and panelists for this 11th webinar in our joint series with ICC and ADB on accelerating cross-border paperless trade. The series has now reached well over 2,000 participants since it was launched, and you're really welcome to access recordings of all the previous webinars from our website. So today's webinars focus on legal aspects of cross-border paperless trade. Legal barriers to the recognition and exchange of trade-related documents are still very much prevalent. According to the UN Global Survey on Digital and Sustainable Trade Facilitation 2021, most countries now have a basic legal framework for electronic transactions and recognition of electronic documents and signature. However, a key issue that is often not addressed in current legislation is the recognition of electronic data, documents, signatures that are coming from outside the country. So we were talking about cross-border recognition here that is not yet there. So there are international and legal instruments that can in principle help address this issue. So one of them is the Framework Agreement on Cross-Border Paperless Trade Facilitation in Asia and the Pacific, which formally started implementation last month. There is also a number of UNCITRAL model laws that are very relevant and available. And various countries are making efforts to develop solutions. This is the case of Singapore, which has been trying to address this issue through its digital partnership agreements as well. So I thank all the experts on the panel today who will introduce and discuss these tools, as well as I'd like to thank my good friend Ramaha from KTNet, who will explain the very practical challenges he faces on implementing cross-border paperless trade because of legal constraints. And I think this will provide very good background information before the introduction of the various tools and possible solutions. So I look forward to learn from the wonderful experts we have with us today for this webinar. Very special thanks to colleagues from UNCITRAL for co-organizing this webinar with us, and I really wish this event a great success. Thank you very much.
Ms. Atita, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Armin. I hope you can hear me well. So many thanks to Armin and Jan for the kind introduction, especially of UNCITRAL, and greetings to ESCAP, ICC, and ADB colleagues, expert presenters, and online participants. It really is an honor to deliver co-opening remarks for today's important webinar on legal aspects of cross-border paperless trade facilitation. With special thanks to ESCAP for the excellent arrangements. I'm Athita Kuminder, head of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, Regional Center for Asia and the Pacific, located in Incheon, Republic of Korea. RCAP is UNCITRAL's only regional center, and with the support of the Republic of Korea and Hong Kong SAR China, we have been executing UNCITRAL's mandate in the region by providing technical assistance and capacity building on commercial law reform to approximately 60 jurisdictions in the Asia Pacific since 2012. UNCITRAL itself was established by the United Nations General Assembly in 1966 to progressively modernize and harmonize the rules of international trade and commerce. As the core legal body of the United Nations system in the field of international trade law, over the past 60 years, UNCITRAL has pursued its mandate by developing a considerable corpus of treaties, model laws, and other legislative and non-legislative texts across a range of commercial law topics, including the digital transformation of trade. UNCITRAL's instruments on e-commerce are one of the most requested topics for assistance in the region. This is not surprising since most countries in the region have already adopted these texts, which have also been endorsed by regional organizations. My colleague, Dr. Luca Castellani, legal officer at UNCITRAL in Vienna, who will share his expertise on UNCITRAL e-commerce texts later today, was actually the first head of RCAP. And in conjunction with Vienna HQ, RCAP has assisted governments in the region, ranging from the Maldives to Mongolia to Papua New Guinea, to adopt the UNCITRAL model law on electronic transferable records. And with key partners such as ESCAP, UNCITRAL assists governments to implement the framework agreement on facilitation of cross-border paperless trade in Asia and the Pacific. RCAP also works with partners like the ACC and ADB to promote awareness and understanding of the MLETR with public and private stakeholders and end users. Last but not least, UNCITRAL RCAP is working with PIFS to support legal aspects of digitization in the Pacific. I invite government officials and stakeholders interested in learning more about the work of UNCITRAL on e-commerce to visit uncitral.un.org and contact RCAP, my office, at uncitral.rcap@un.org. This information is also available on the webinar information page. I thank ESCAP again for this privilege. Thank you.
Please, let's go with the next speaker for the opening remarks. Manarat.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Hannah Nguyen, Director of Digital Ecosystems at the ICC Digital Standards Initiative. We have a big mission to accelerate trade and supply chain digitization by establishing a globally harmonized and digitized trading environment. And our goal at the end of the day is to ensure that every supply chain participant is able to exchange data digitally from end to end, and doing so in an open, interoperable ecosystem supported by enabling regulations. So to harmonize the standards used for digital trade, we have set up an industry advisory board that comprises of industry leaders from all industry verticals and geographical regions to support semantic and technical interoperability. The DSI has also teamed up with the World Trade Organization to co-publish a standards toolkit for cross-border paperless trade, which is now available for free in 7 global languages. However, we realized very early on in this mission that in order to create a truly globally harmonized and digitalized trading environment, this cannot be achieved by standards implementation and adoption alone. Legal reform is urgently required. A case in point is that not all countries around the world have the appropriate legislative framework to recognize electronic transferable records, which is a backbone of international trade. And as a result of this, Currently, less than 1% of global trade documents are digitized end-to-end. So with that context, we are very pleased today to co-host this webinar, which focuses on legal aspects of cross-border paperless trade facilitation. It has been our pleasure to work with colleagues from ESCAP, UNCITRAL, and ADB on this webinar series. And today's topic is particularly important. Without the legal certainty that electronic exchanges across borders can be officially recognized, we will not have trade digitization at scale. So I'm delighted to see today a mix of legal practitioners and implementers in the session, and I look forward to hearing from all of you about cutting-edge approaches and legal solutions to enable cross-border paperless trade. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to the joint webinar on legal aspects of cross-border paperless trade facilitation. Enhancing the participation of MSMEs in global value chains is a key solution to unlock new productivity and inclusive growth. While MSMEs account for more than 90% of enterprises and about 70% of national labor force in developing Asia, their contribution to exports and GDPs are disproportionately limited. Trade digitalization offers benefits to lower trade costs and enhance their participation. It can lower the cost of accessing trade finance for smaller firms, which usually lack resources and collaterals to qualify for trade finance loans. However, digitalization requires the enormous task of establishing common standards and platforms. International cooperation will be needed to achieve this, while also recognizing the need for developing economies to acquire needed infrastructure and know-how. ADB, for instance, is supporting the Digital Standards Initiative to drive interoperability between various parts of the trade ecosystem. Another key component of trade digitalization is the global adoption of the Legal Entity Identifier System, a harmonized identity system for each business registered. Aside from international cooperation, national legislative reforms are also needed to enable the UN model laws on the electronic transfer of records, or MLETR. So I look forward to today's discussion on various aspects of legal recognition of electronic exchange of information. In today's world of multiple crises, we need to work closely together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for our opening remarks, speakers. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Mr. Raul Renner, Deputy Director and leading on the legal reform in ICC, who also represents the global business at the United Nations General Assembly and leads the ICC Working Group on e-commerce, providing business perspective for the Joint Statement Initiative on the trade-related aspects of electronic commerce at the World Trade Organization. Dear Raul, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Armin. And I want to say thank you to the speakers for making yourselves available for today's session. And thank you to our audience members for your time. Knowing the caliber of our panelists today, I trust that this will be an interesting and action-oriented session with many useful takeaways for policymakers and traders alike. Today, we're discussing legal aspects of cross-border paperless trade facilitation, a vitally important dimension if we are to achieve end-to-end digitalization in international supply chains. Without further ado, let's get into it. First, I am delighted to invite Donghuan Li from KTNet to deliver our first intervention. Don has very kindly stepped in for his colleague Ramaha and is an expert in his own right on trade facilitation and digitalization. Don has hands-on experience and extensive knowledge of international trade. He began his international trade career with Hanwha Corporation, where he worked from 1994 to 2000. Don then worked as the director for a Silicon Valley office of a Korean high-tech startup for a couple of years, providing him with practical knowledge and experience on cutting-edge ICT. Don then worked as a project manager at KTNet where he established a global paperless trade service network to enable cross-border transactions of electronic documents between Korea and the European Union member countries, focusing on interoperability between each country's paperless trade hubs. Don has initiated business opportunities and system implementation projects under the framework of ODA and trade facilitation programs of the Korean government, multilateral development banks, and other institutions. This includes a vast array of projects, from creating a new customs system for Mongolian customs, implementation of a trade network system for foreign trade financed by the Libyan government, modules of the Peruvian single window system 2.0, modernizing the Kenyan Customs Administration, and the list goes on. With a bachelor's degree in economics from Korea University in Seoul, Don Lee also has his MBA from that same institution and is completing coursework for a PhD in international trade at Dankook University, where he's focusing on how to share Korea's knowledge and experience on e-government and paperless trade with developing countries in order to contribute to their sustainable growth. So very topical to today's discussion. We look forward to hearing from Don today regarding challenges with respect to the legal aspects of sharing data across borders. Welcome, Don. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Great, it's a really great introduction. I really appreciate. Thank you for inviting me for this ESCAP-UNCITRAL-ICC and ADB co-hosted a webinar on legal aspects of cross-border paperless trade facilitation. As introduced, my name is Don Lee, and I'm working for Korea Trade Network, KTNet. As well known, KTNet is the national digital trade platform operator in Korea. KTNet's trade facilitation services cover the entire scope of trade procedures, including customs clearance, import-export logistics, trade financing, cross-border e-commerce facilitation, and cross-border exchange of electronic trade documents. Well, thanks to globalization, global enterprises source their parts and raw materials all over the world. This is so-called global supply chain. As Korea has many global manufacturing companies in diverse fields of industries, many Korean companies are invited to the supply chains of such global enterprises and often requested to develop a system to be connected to their clients' electronic supply chain management system. KTNet has been facilitating the exchange of electronic trade documents between Korean suppliers and foreign buyers and vice versa. The most common trade documents being exchanged are purchase order, it is so-called PO, and delivery forecasting, such as Delgit, Delfo, something like that, invoice, and advanced shipping notice. One of the big issues which KTNet faces is that the electronic documents issued from overseas are not being recognized by the Korean government, such as Korean customs. Even though Korea has laws which allows the use and legal recognition of electronic documents and electronic signatures, still when it comes to the recognition of electronic documents and electronic signatures originated from the foreign countries, it is a real challenge. Due to the negotiation of digital economy partnership agreement with other countries, the Korean government is now well aware of the importance of the recognition of foreign electronic documents and signatures. However, still Korean government seeks for the best practices in order to implement the legal framework for the recognition of foreign electronic documents and signatures. UNCITRAL model law on electronic commerce could be a good reference for the Korean government. However, when it comes to the recognition of foreign electronic documents, we have to differentiate the business-to-business processes from the business to government, B2G processes. Under the mutual agreement between the business parties, the B2B transactions have no restriction on the adoption of technology in their exchange of electronic documents. But the B2G is different from that of B2B. So when the documents are supposed to be submitted to the government for some administration process or issue, there shall be certain restrictions that the government can accept the electronic documents. The challenge would be how to harmonize these gaps in the legal framework for cross-border exchange and recognition of electronic messages. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Don, for your intervention. I agree with you. It's so important to provide for cross-border recognition, both of electronic documents, but also transferable records, which I think necessarily involves recognizing those documents, instruments, or records, even if they originate in other countries. It's great to see that KTNet is apprised of this issue. Thank you for your intervention. I'll move now to our second speaker, which is Soo Hyun Kim. Sue is the Economic Affairs Officer within the Trade Policy and Facilitation section of the Trade Investment and Innovation Division at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or UN ESCAP. Sue is currently managing capacity building projects on cross-border paperless trade and trade facilitation in the age of pandemics, and supporting the implementation of the Framework Agreement on Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade in Asia and the Pacific. Sue previously worked in the Investment and Enterprise Development section with a focus on foreign direct investment and investment regimes and their impact on sustainable development. Sue also worked to promote public-private sector dialogue by organising the Asia-Pacific Business Forum and supporting the ESCAP Sustainable Business Network. Prior to this, Sue worked at the United Nations Secretariat in New York, in local government in the United Kingdom, and within higher education also in the UK. Sue holds master's degrees in business administration with a specialisation in financial management from TIA's Nimbus Business School in the Netherlands, and library and information science from Loughborough University in the UK. We're delighted to hear from Sue about the legal dimensions of the Framework Agreement on the facilitation of cross-border paperless trade in Asia and the Pacific. And if I can make a quick plug from the global business perspective, the Framework Agreement presents a tremendous opportunity to harmonize legal frameworks with respect to cross-border paperless trade. We are big fans at ICC of the Framework Agreement and all of the work that ESCAP is doing in this regard. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Sue.
Thank you very much, Raul, for kind introduction. It's actually mutual feeling. I'm a big fan of ICC, as you know, so very glad to be here and glad to present some of the progress that we made, as well as the fundamentals of the Framework Agreement, which can support the legal basis for cross-border exchange. So let me share my presentation. Can I just get confirmation that you can see it fully?
We can, if it's possible, can you make it full screen?
Okay. Okay, I'll try sharing it again, actually. Just give me 1 second, sorry.
Yeah, no problem at all. So I think we can see clearly enough. I think this is good.
Okay.
For now. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, I will, as I've said, I just will introduce the Framework Agreement, the progress that we have made. Let me start with the introduction of the basics. The Framework Agreement on the Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade in Asia and the Pacific. It's a UN treaty open to all ESCAP member states to become parties. What it does is, if people are familiar with the WTO TFA, it's more of an enabling and action-oriented agreements without any time-limited requirements required. So we actually support the countries to set their own timeline in order to pursue their journey towards the trade digitalization. And it was actually designed in this way intentionally because we saw the variety of development stages in Asia and the Pacific. So it is a starting point of facilitating cross-border paperless trade, data exchange, and it's complementary to the WTO TFA with the focus on the digital solutions. It also supports the sub-regional efforts such as ASEAN single window and such. So I just wanted to touch upon the milestones that the framework has achieved. So it started at the 2012 as a regional study. And after 4 years of development process, we actually have adopted at the Commission as a UN treaty in May 2016. Afterwards, with 5 countries joining the framework agreement, it entered into force only in February 2021. Since then, we have actually had some additional members who joined us. So currently we have Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, China, Iran, Philippines, and Timor-Leste, and Turkmenistan. Out of these, Armenia and Cambodia are only signatories, not a member yet. And there are other countries who has joined. And in addition to these countries, there are several other countries, including Republic of Korea, who is planning and expediting their domestic procedures to join the framework agreement by the end of 2022. We had our first meeting of the Paperless Trade Council in April, and we will have the first meeting of the Standing Committee in 2022, Q4. What I wanted to really highlight out of the framework agreement, as I've said, it's giving the solid basis for the cross-border data exchange and enabling the countries to pursue the journey towards it. It's a starting point, but there's a specific Article 10, which is related to the legal instruments, enabling cross-border paperless trade. So as you can read here, the parties are encouraged to adopt relevant international legal instruments by United Nations bodies and other international organizations. So it's referring to the standard and legal framework by the UN and other organizations. Of course, this one includes UNCITRAL, and UNCITRAL has been very instrumental in implementing the framework agreement in this regard. It also says that the cross-border exchange of trade-related data and documents in electronic form to be consistent with the international law. So as the speaker from the KTNet said, and also Raul mentioned, even when one country has established their domestic procedures, the foreign entities issued documents cannot be recognized quite often. And this is the problem that we have identified, and it's something that we are really trying to pursue, having some regional dialogues and solutions out of the framework agreement. So this one on the consistency with the international law, as well as the interoperability, is the key principles in the framework agreement. If I can just briefly share with you the progress that we have made, or the aim that we are pursuing under the Article 10. So this is part of the draft roadmap the interim steering group has produced. So the interim steering group, even before the framework agreement entered into force, they have done kind of a pre-homework of establishing some actions and tasks relevant to each articles. So under the Article 10, it has identified the action as the taking into account and adopt available and accepted international legal instruments. In this regard, there are certain tasks Or for example, the first one, identifying relevant provisions of international law, regional and international regulations and best practices. Also developing a guide in this regard. And the third one refers to applying the relevant legal instruments. These tasks, when you see on the third row for the implementation ownership, this is referring to who will be taking actions in implementing it. So once again, this is a draft roadmap by the interim steering group. So it is yet to be decided by the parties of the framework agreement once it entered into force in 2021. The standing committee, which will have its first meeting, we hope that they would be adopting this draft roadmap into account and really building upon it. So implementation ownership, the first and second task would be done collectively by all parties, and the third one would be at the national level by individual parties. So once again, we've done some homework, a pre-homework, and what we have done is that we have compiled a reference list of the legal frameworks that really directly supports the cross-border paperless trade. And also this has been included in the cross-border paperless trade database, which is shown here. You can visit it at www.digitalizedtrade.org. I don't have the time to elaborate it in extensive details here, but we have been really launching and introducing it in several different platforms, and I hope to introduce it again in other opportunities within the webinar series. But Armen, who is also instrumental in this webinar series, he is currently managing and updating the beta version of the database. And under this database, we have collected some projects and services relevant to the cross-border paperless trade, but directly relevant to the Article 10. We have a section for the legal instruments, and that once again contains the reference list directly supporting the cross-border data exchange at national, sub-regional, and global level. So I would like to encourage all of you to visit this database, and it's a beta version, as I've said. So if you have any suggestions, let us know. Armen and the team would be taking those into account. So that's the end of a very short presentation. I hope I have given you enough for you to at least have some interest in and how the framework agreement can support the journey of the countries towards cross-border paperless trade, especially under the Article 10 for the legal framework agreement, legal framework. So this is all from me. And once again, thank you very much to Raul, the moderator, and all the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Sue, and congratulations to you and Armen for the work on the cross-border paperless trade database. So you heard it here, folks, digitalizedtrade.org. I invite everyone to go onto that website. I just had a look at the legal instruments. It's great to see. I'm sure the Melita will be making its way onto there that Luca will be addressing in a moment. And I must say it was exciting to hear from your colleague, Sue, Jan Duval, yesterday when he noted that more and more countries are acceding to the framework agreement. It's great to see that momentum. So thank you so much for your time today. Our next speaker is Ankur Huria from the World Bank Group. Ankur Huria is a Senior Trade and Regional Integration Specialist in the Trade and Regional Integration Department of the World Bank Group. At the bank, he has more than 14 years of experience in developing and contributing to the trade and integration agenda in over 40 countries in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. His work is focused on trade logistics and corridors, trade facilitation and border management, regional integration, digital trade, standards for trade, national quality infrastructure, agribusiness supply chains, investment climate issues, value chains, and private sector developments. It sounds to me any issue with respect to international trade, Ankur will be more than able to advise us. He holds master's degrees in public policy and business administration, with previous industry experience in consumer goods and consulting in the private and non-profit sectors in logistics and supply chain and financial business advisory. Possibly as the first cases of COVID-19 were percolating throughout Wuhan in December 2019, but certainly before the world was forced into lockdown, Ankur wrote the prescient World Bank report, Facilitating Trade and Logistics for E-commerce, Building Blocks, Challenges, and Ways Forward. Among other things, the report discusses the need for a legal environment for automation and wades into issues of data protection and privacy, electronic signatures, legal validity for electronic transactions, and other issues. We're delighted to have Ankur with us today to provide an overview of building blocks for facilitating cross-border e-commerce. Ankur, you have the floor. Thank you. Ankur, my apologies. I'm not sure whether it's just an issue on my end or if others are feeling it.
Let me repeat that. I was on mute. Apologies. Well, I was saying thank you, and thank you very much for having me here today. And I would also like to thank ESCAP-UNCITRAL-ICC and ADB. It's a pleasure to be at this presentation. I will try and share my screen in a minute if it's possible. And hopefully we can get going on the presentation. Please do confirm once you can see me or see the screen.
Yes, that looks good. If you could navigate to the slideshow presentation. Excellent.
Super. Okay, so here we are. Okay, sorry. So at the World Bank Group, we do a lot of work in the trade facilitation and logistics space. Just before COVID, when we did an assessment of how much work we were doing, we found that we, over the past decade, put in about $7 billion of financing on these issues around the globe to try and address the challenges, provide solutions to countries that requested them. So a lot of our experience comes from the implementation side, which includes the legal pieces, because the legal pieces are a very critical part for cross-border trade, but also because there's a whole bunch of underlying infrastructure under those legal pieces that needs to be in place for the legal pieces to actually function and for seamless cross-border trade to actually happen. So if we sort of just look briefly at an average trade transaction, and we say that there are a huge number of parties, 20 to 30, huge number of documents of almost 200 data elements, and we say we need to have these crisscross different parts of the world. So you really have the flow of payments, you have the flow of information, and you have the flow of actual goods. And you need to make all of that happen in the most efficient manner. The advantage of electronic communication, the electronic piece is, of course, that both for information and payment, you can get much speedier movement of this, whereas the goods flow is impacted by the actual physical flow of the goods, which leads to all the different transport modalities and the different logistics nodes along the way. But then, if you look at the legal enabling environment, you would say, what is the overall enabling environment, or do you have the laws and regulations in place? But then do you also have the implementation effectiveness for those laws and regulations? And how is that really judged? I mean, what is the level of, for instance, in the trade facilitation, what's the level of readiness of border agencies? You can have all the laws you want on electronic transactions, but if the border agencies are not automated, don't have the culture, there are lots of other issues, then a paper copy is still needed, required, and that creates a lot of friction. The telecom, internet, e-payment infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure impacts this ability for legal transactions. There are specific challenges. At the bank, we are very concerned about inclusiveness So there are specific challenges faced by SMEs to participate in electronic trade. If you look at the logistics side of things, you also would then want to look at, postal services, which, in many countries are the leading way in which e-commerce actually happens. And where they're not the leading way, they're often behind simply because they don't have the appropriate automated capabilities and the way to interact with private and public sectors, and this sets those countries back from a reach perspective. And then there is the air connectivity side and new technologies, and those challenging new technologies, and what should be adopted, what kind of laws need to be modified in relation to all of this. And then, of course, COVID happened, and COVID meant there was a lot of uptake and a lot of advances in many of these things. Some things, there was a bit of a setback, for instance, air connectivity. And air connectivity in many parts of the world is still not recovered, still under the process of recovering. But for the most part, everybody else upped their game, and investments on a lot of digitization and this underlying infrastructure have begun to take place, which really allow the advances on the legal side to be accommodated.
Sorry to just break the flow, but I think that your screen is frozen. Is there a way that we can see the presentation in full slide mode?
Yeah, let me try 1 second. It is on full slide, but I will stop the share and try it again, if that helps.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we're just getting a few comments about the screen.
If it doesn't work, what I can do is quickly email it to you, and maybe you can share it from your side. Is it
okay? That seems quite better. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I have it on my mobile phone. I can see it on my mobile phone, so I know it's definitely out there.
Great. Thanks so much.
So then if we look at specifically to the nature of e-commerce and not just cross-border trade in general, there are resolutions, standards, frameworks out there that support this from the legal perspective. The Luxury Resolution in particular on advanced electronic data and risk management, the WCO standards that relate to legal framework, interagency cooperation and information sharing, public-private partnerships, international cooperation. And this is not because there's the UNCITRAL, UNC-FACT number of recommendations, laws, and standards are unlisted because they're a humongous amount, and they are literally one of the first resources that countries and us we do look at. But I was also trying to put some things out there that we look at from a more formal, from a more implementation below the legal underlying infrastructure, what customs authorities and others tend to look at. And then for developing countries, setting up this and enabling this legal and regulatory framework requires investing in new institutional mechanisms, and that's not necessarily very easy. Easier for middle income and advanced countries, so but a little bit more difficult for developing countries. It's not just about passing that law, but then doing a lot of work under it to make sure that the implementation of that law and the effectiveness of this law is actually in place. And who would you empower to that group to put in place for protection of data? How do you bring all of these things, the legal certainty in place, etc.? And so these things often take time, can be behind, and so the acceptance is often years behind the actual passing of a law. The legal environment is also impacted by the legal tradition, the attitude towards regulations in general. There are many countries where in practice is very different from the de jure and de facto pieces separate, are far and wide. The enabling laws, the liability issues, the liabilities for lots of things on dispute resolution, on who holds what. There's a confounding number of things. And then this is depending on the prevailing or historic economic model. The kind of colonialism you had and the kind of law that you have, whether it was French or Commonwealth or whatever else, the quality of governance and the rule of law and political granted, many of these impact general lawmaking, but in a case where we want frictionless trade, it's particularly impactful, and many times companies and other countries and others doing cross-border trade tend to discount this particular part. So on data protection and privacy, we have seen a significant increase. UNCTAD does this really good compilation, and for the most part, I think they update it every year on 3 or 4 areas. And I think we've seen a rapid increase in the past 6-7 years on the number of countries that have some form of data protection and privacy legislation. And this is really good because it allows for the protection of personal information, which we know from our personal thing into social media, etc., is something that has got recognition, but is pretty critically important for business, trade, e-commerce. But it creates its own set of challenges in the implementation side. For instance, it impacts some countries have laws where they want an equivalent level of data protection before they can share they allow for sharing of data, and the EU has had this for a really long time. For developing countries, there's often a cost to enforce these data protection laws. There is a lack of public and private sector knowledge and cooperation on the issue. And then traders don't often trust their governments. There are concerns about integrity of the payment systems, of fraud. And then on the flip side, you have overly strict data protection laws that can restrict activities such as investment, innovation, and the emergence of new technologies. Another area where we've seen a rapid uptake, and I think the numbers increased significantly in the last 2-3 years over the COVID period, was on e-transaction legislation. And again, it's about almost 158 countries, and UNCTAD states this is about 81%. And 79 of these are developing countries, and many of them in the recent past. And they provide the same legal equivalence as paper-based transactions and are very, very critical for cross-border trade and e-commerce. And without the adoption of such standards, traders lack legal certainty, legal validity. And sometimes, despite the presence of these laws, paper is still submitted and stored and utilized in the trade transaction process. Cross-border is littered with this. We have ports and customs authorities still demanding this at various borders, despite laws being in the book, simply because there's a whole set of issues that actually need to be enabled before this can become truly digital trade, so as to speak. Then there are issues related to electronic signature, certification authorities, mutual recognition. Electronic signatures have obviously have been very, very important during the COVID period. And this is from an electronic commerce perspective. I think there has been, I would argue, at least in the countries we're working, we see a bit of a big breakthrough on electronic signatures. We have, and the acceptance of electronic signatures has vastly increased. But then there's also the mutual recognition of certification authorities, and there are some interesting cases there where there's often a misconception that when you have 2 different countries use different kinds of digital signatures, that there could be a problem for mutual recognition. But really, it's more about the process and not necessarily about the signature itself and a recognition of the process. It's similar to mutual recognition generally in trade of all kinds of standards and certifications between countries. You have for SPS and other trade areas. And again, UNISTRL has a lot of extensive guidance on all of this that is there. When we work with the countries, we look at how these laws, regulations are in line with some of these international standards and guidance, and then we begin from there to see if reforms still need to be done, or then the underlying issues are really below that in their implementation. Finally, my last slide, just quickly on, sort of placeholding a few other items that impact this: data retention, electronic archiving, and how will data be stored? In what form will it be stored? How long can it be stored? Who can you share that data within the countries? How can that data be utilized? For what kind of disputes? These are still, we're still scratching the surface on a lot of these things in many of the countries, but they become very critical from a perspective of cross-border data. And then from a perspective of related issues, there's obviously consumer protection, where again we've seen an increase in consumer protection. 115 have adopted legislation to some extent. It is behind cybercrime. Cybercrime, being a police matter, seems to catch the interest of more countries, and almost 156 countries have established legislation related to that. Two other side issues, or very important issues, related to electronic invoicing and electronic payment. They are impacted by electronic legislation. The standards, the formats, the history, the tax systems, the types of platforms, whether public or private, the SMEs, how big a role they play in all of this, impacts electronic invoicing. And then from electronic payment, the lack of automation, or lack of single payment in many countries, the types of payment availability are other factors that determine this. I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Rahul. I'm happy to take questions towards the end.
Thanks so much, Ankur. That was a fascinating intervention. I really liked how you looked at it from a number of different angles. Of course, it's not just about passage of legislation, but about, acceptance of technology, the maturation of the legal system, institutions around governance and accountability. Thank you so much. Really interesting. I think there's already a question about electronic signatures and whether we need a more harmonized approach that we can explore in the Q&A. So thank you again, and we'll move to the next speaker. I'm very pleased to welcome Renyu K. Renyu is an officer with the Trade Trust team at the Infocom Media Development Authority in Singapore, which is at the forefront of the orchestration of social and economic digitalization in collaboration with other Singapore government agencies. He currently manages the trade trust engagements with other governments as well as international organizations, including those active in standards development. Renyu has more than 23 years of professional experience in digital initiatives and projects in the domains of logistics, maritime transport, and trade facilitation. This includes extensive experience in the private sector, undertaking various leadership roles, overseeing business development and project implementation portfolios spanning global markets. And if I can say, having met Renyu, that he has a real skill in communicating what are sometimes quite complex and arcane topics in trade facilitation and relating these to the everyday experiences of all of us. One memorable exchange, if I may, Kay, involved what I think was quite a powerful analogy that you made between the use of QR codes in COVID-19 vaccine verification schemes and the use of electronic transferable records in cross-border trade. We're delighted to have you here with us today to discuss how digital economy agreements, or DEAs, are being used to bridge legal gaps in cross-border paperless trade. Thank you so much, Kay. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rahul. Allow me to share my screen. And do please let me know once you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it clearly. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Rahul. Let me take this away. The Infocom Media Development Authority, just a very quick blurb here, is basically responsible for orchestrating the digital development of Singapore. Now, trade being such an important part of Singapore's economy, that is why we pay a lot of attention to digitalizing this particular sector. And in that line, it is important that the businesses that are engaged in international trade be connected digitally. It's time to move away from the universal medium of information transfer called paper. So that is the role of IMDA. And what you see here is really our problem statement. I shan't belabor this point about, the difficulties with paper, but I'd like to shine some light into a less known problem. Just because you use technology in your trade processes and your business processes isn't really enough, because there are plenty of fragmented digital islands out there. And unfortunately, the medium that is used to bridge those digital islands sometimes have to fall back on paper. And of course, we also have to consider that there are certain stubbornly persisting documents like bills of lading or other transferable documents that have resisted this digitalization for a very long time. Now, when we look at digital economy agreements, right, they are, as always, a means to an end. And really, what are those ends? This is a very high-level summary or frame for which you can see that. And I've drawn a box around the parts that are, I suppose, relevant for our discussion here today. So specifically, in terms of facilitating seamless end-to-end digital trade, this is where it is important to have an enabling electronic transactions framework. Now, Singapore has done that. In fact, we are the beneficiary of a lot of UNCITRAL's work, model laws on e-commerce, model laws on electronic signature, model law on electronic transferable records is simply the latest one. And therefore, thank you for that, UNCITRAL and other UN agencies. But if we now look at, taking it forward, the fact is trade involves at least, at least cross-border trade involves at least two parties, and they might not all be in the same jurisdiction. And this is the reason why it's very important to have such a harmonized legal framework. And in taking that to the world, right, the model laws are a global standard around which the jurisdictions can align ourselves against or align ourselves along with. So in terms of target outcomes, we're trying to facilitate seamless end-to-end digital trade, as well as to enable secure data flows and trust in digital systems. But where we speak about digital trade and making it paperless, these are the specific outcomes. And when you translate all that into business benefits, it's to provide trusted, secure, and convenient way to transact, increase efficiencies, and reduce cost. IMDA is a government statutory board. We are an agency and a government agency, and we are here to serve our community. So in terms of, zooming into the facilitating and seamless end-to-end digital trade, this is where we look at both where B and G interact, as well as where B's and B's interact. Sorry, B's being businesses and G's being government. And it is our responsibility to try to reduce that friction and make it as efficient as possible. So to that end, Singapore has actually invested a lot of time and effort in this project called Trade Trust. And Trade Trust, and when you look at digital economy agreements as a means to work with like-minded partners, right, to push the boundaries of law and so on and so forth, we also found it necessary to provide a means to make use of those new laws. which is where trade trust comes in. So trade trust is a project which is designed to provide industry the means to verify the authenticity and source of a document, as well as to enable digitalization of transferable documents. Now, when we digitalize those verifiable documents, things like certificates, licenses, packing lists, so on and so forth, we use technology to ensure the authenticity of that and the source of that. Now, funnily enough, there is a document, and this is something that Raul alluded to just now, that has really picked up in terms of use over COVID. And in fact, as our borders open up, we will continue to see that more and more. And these are the vaccine passports or the vaccine certificates. So actually, what you will realize is that when you take your vaccine certificate and you present it to a destination authority and multiple destination authorities, if you are doing a world tour, you never realize that actually all these systems that are verifying it at the destination are not the same systems that were used to create them. And we've just taken it for granted. Now, if we can do that for a vaccine certificate, we can definitely do that for a trade document, because the benefits are the same. You need to assure yourselves, assuming that you're the destination importer, you still need to assure yourself that, yeah, that document hadn't been tampered with. And you need to assure yourself that this was really created from the party that I expected to create it. For example, you would need to be assured that a bill of lading was created by the maritime transport operator. You need to assure yourselves that the packing list was created by the person who packed, probably the forwarder who packed the container. So all this is important, and technology can help to assure that that confidence. And in terms of transferable documents, which is a class of documents that enable performance obligation transfers, this is where the trade trust framework uses tokenization, or specifically non-fungible tokenization methods to achieve them. I will go a bit more into detail when in later slides about how the ML-ETR requirements are satisfied. But bear in mind that here the authenticity and source of normal documents or verifiable documents would be using W3C verifiable credentials methods. So trade trust is not a platform, it is a framework, right? And it comprises of multiple thrusts. Well, because we're dealing with transferable documents, there is certainly that thrust on legal harmonization. But in addition to that, there are also other areas that need attention. So for example, the development of standards so that the industry is able to be aligned towards technical methods that they don't have to code and recode for every different business partner, right? When everybody is utilizing a similar standard, then we can achieve that efficiency gain and scalability. Accreditation is, of course, an optional item as discussed in the model law on electronic transferable records, and is something that Singapore is still thinking through very carefully. And lastly, trade trust is available as software components that are open sourced, because these technical methods, we bake them into these open source software components that can be easily integrated, so as to reduce the need for industry to keep reinventing or rebuilding the wheel. This slide is meant to convey the message that trade trust being a framework, it is here to support commercial applications and platforms and to bridge these different commercial applications and platforms in terms of achieving the three functionalities that I spoke about before. The technical methods are implemented in open source code and freely available to anybody, and is interrogatable by anybody who is interested. To keep it open and neutral, Trade Trust follows a couple of design principles. I just want to talk about it here very quickly. So number one, because international trade is also a very open ecosystem, the technology must reflect the same. So we utilize public and permissionless blockchains so that there is no undue influence from any one central governance authority. Because it is public, the data has to be kept off chain. Otherwise, you compromise commercial confidentiality. The framework is designed to work with whatever format the participants wish to utilize. So it's designed to be payload agnostic. It is open source, as mentioned before, and very importantly, MLETR compliant. This part is slightly a bit more technical, so please bear with me. So if you look at the left-hand side column, the way that Melita, the way that Melita was, was the way that it was approached. You looked at the paper requirements, and then Melita sort of defined the electronic equivalent of it. And we took those requirements and we said, okay, how shall we actually achieve it programmatically? So the unique original title document, Melita framed it as being needing to identify a singular record, and that is achieved by Trade Trust through tokenization, the non-fungible tokenization method, as I explained before. The possession of a title document, that got rendered into exclusive control, right? And that is achieved through Trade Trust by a smart contract that runs on the blockchain. The endorsement chain on a title document that is required by Melita to show or to enforce integrity of the electronic record. And that is achieved by Trade Trust through a cryptographic hash and the use of a public ledger. Trade Trust is accessible to all, and we are constantly working with many parties, which I will talk about later. But very importantly, it is middleware, and that allows or that enables application service providers to continue to innovate on their applications to deliver value to their paying customers. And we are not here to compete with that. We are here to support that. Think of Trade Trust as an adapter that different application service providers can use to easily connect to the blockchain layers to carry out these digitalization activities. This is my last slide, where I highlight the various global partnerships that we've had the pleasure of undertaking. And of course, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that Trade Trust is mentioned in ICC's Standards Toolkit. Thank you for that. We're very proud to be included in that. And we continue to look out for internationally relevant partners to work with to explore Trade Trust. And this is just where you can find more documentation on it. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Kay. It's great, always great to hear from you and to hear more about Trade Trust. I think I see there's a question that we'll try and get to in the Q&A, essentially around are there further plans for more DEAs between Singapore and other countries? Let's see if we can get to that. But moving now to our final speaker, and rounding out this stellar panel of experts is none other than Luca Castellani, Legal Officer in the Secretariat of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, or UNCITRAL. As Secretary of UNCITRAL Working Group 4 on Electronic Commerce, Luca oversaw the preparation of the UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records, as well as work on the use and cross-border recognition of identity management and trust services. He has assisted several countries in the enactment of UNCITRAL texts on electronic commerce. He is also active in the field of paperless trade facilitation and contributed to drafting of the Framework Agreement on Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade in Asia and the Pacific. It's wonderful to have you here with us, Luca. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with so many friends and colleagues and to discuss these matters. Mindful of time, I would like to go straight to my presentation. Hopefully we'll address some of the issues that have been raised. Now, at a very general level, please let me allow to say this is something which is implicit in everything that has been said so far. When we want to promote the digital economy, which now has two main goals, which is to say to allow, of course, exchange of information remotely, anywhere, anytime, but also to enable the use and reuse and analysis of data. We have to put together three elements: policy, technical, and legal. I think many have discussed policy and technical issues. Today, we are focusing a bit more on the legal, and it's a great pleasure for me to see so much interest and active participation from our audience. Now, the legal itself can be divided in two parts: the enabling part and the regulatory part. The enabling removes obstacles, legal obstacles to the use of electronic transactions, and tries to clarify what is their legal effect and status. The regulation is also important in the Ankur mentioned before issues, for instance, like data privacy and protection. These are, of course, legal requirements that need to be complied with in order to carry out lawfully certain activities. Data privacy and protection would be relevant mostly for what I mentioned before on data flows, data use, and data analysis. There is an increasing interaction between the text that I'm going to discuss now and national law, and the relevant provision in free trade agreements or regional trade agreements. Digital economy agreements have also been mentioned. In reality, how this comes together is that free trade agreements may have a chapter on e-commerce, so do regional trade agreements. The digital economy agreement is actually the latest and most advanced iteration, which is very specific to e-commerce. Of course, many of us are waiting for the outcome of the so-called JSI, Joint Statement Initiative discussions in Geneva, the WTO. Very important for Asia and the Pacific, as the three countries that are the initiators, the co-conveners of the dialogue, are countries in East Asia, that is to say Japan, Singapore, and Australia. So we have to keep that in mind to see why Asia is now at the center of all of these activities. Now, the specific issue is how to promote cross-border recognition of electronic communications, and the answer is in UNCITRAL texts, and I do thank for all the speakers have already mentioned that. Now, how many UNCITRAL texts we have now? We have 4 texts, which we will quickly see in detail, and the 5th one is to be considered by the Commission next week in New York, and it is the model law on identity management and trust services, which actually builds on, for instance, on the EU eIDAS regulation, which has been mentioned in the chat box. So we may have an additional tool there. That one is a specific, it is really called on the use and cross-border recognition. So the cross-border element is particularly prominent in that text. As I said, these texts have been altogether adopted in more than 100 states, many of them in Asia and the Pacific. I would say the majority of countries in Asia and the Pacific have adopted it. And more than that, there are, for instance, ASEAN has made a point of identifying UNCITRAL texts as an objective of its work plan on e-commerce. The same applies, for instance, to the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. So also in Asia, the sub-regional level, we have a strong commitment. Not to speak about regional FTAs like CPTPP or RCEP, which cross-reference UNCITRAL texts, and so adoption of UNCITRAL text becomes a way implement and fully realize the benefits of the free trade agreements. The model law on electronic commerce, it's from 1996, but it is the foundational one, the one where has the three fundamental principles of non-discrimination against the use of electronic means, functional equivalence, and technology neutrality. This model law has been adopted in more than 80 states, actually, and is still being adopted, although with the adjustments due to the development of new business practices. But fundamentally, it has been drafted in a manner which is future-proof, and it is to this day the real core of an electronic transactions law. The model law on electronic signatures has been adopted in 38 states, actually. And what is interesting here is that for the first time, we see rules that are specific to facilitate the recognition of foreign signatures and also foreign certificates, because this model law is technology neutral, but it keeps in mind the widespread use of encryption to provide a higher level of security in electronic signatures with respect to the origin and the integrity of the signed data message, the signed communication. So here, for the first time, we see rules that say that the reliability of the signature should be assessed without reference to its place of origin or of use, which of course is particularly important because we are talking here measuring against the technical standards. And technical standards should be, if they are internationally accepted and broadly recognized, then they should apply regardless of the country where they have to be applied. This is, of course, the beauty of having science, which is science should provide guidance regardless of borders. Already in 2005, the Commission decided to tackle the issue of cross-border recognition, at least when it comes to business transactions, and produced a convention. A convention is a treaty, it's an international agreement, so it operates directly at the international level, and it automatically validates these electronic transactions, including electronic signatures. This convention has been adopted by 15 states, many of them in Asia and the Pacific. Number 16 will come next week, and we congratulate the Philippines actually for doing that. And hopefully this will help more states to join in. I believe this treaty is quite comprehensive, and it does very well the job when it comes to business transactions. It may be that it didn't get so far full attention because sometimes some are real solutions. Some solutions are real solutions, but there is limited awareness of the problem. Now, after the COVID-19, we are much more aware of the issue. Before, the legal discourse was more focusing on domestic issues. And now we know more that we need certainty and predictability across borders. And so I really hope that there will be more awareness and more interest for this treaty, as it is the main element in the UNCITRAL suite of texts that addresses cross-border matters. And then many have already referred to the model on electronic transfer records, MLETR or MELITA. We all love MELITA. MELITA does contain provisions, specific provision that says that again, the reliability of the methods used for the management of the electronic transfer records has to be assessed on a geographic neutral basis. I saw a question in the chat. I would like to reply now. MELITA deals with electronic transfer records, but also sets the standards for other records. So the way this is envisaged now is that an ecosystem for digital trade has to integrate all the different commercial documents. And in order to integrate all of those documents, it has to benchmark the highest standard in terms of security, and the highest standard being MELITA, it will benchmark MELITA. But does that exclude electronic records that are non-transferable? Absolutely not. That includes them and actually provides additional security to them. And actually, Raul and I were, and other people were discussing this yesterday at an event at ICAO with respect to airway bills of lading, for instance. But the same would apply to straight bills of lading, which are not negotiable, and so on and so forth. So Jan has already mentioned that there is a very close relationship in between the ancestral text and the comprehensive paperless trade agreement, which is the framework agreement she mentioned before. Firstly, the framework agreement spells out the principles that I mentioned before: functional equivalence, non-discrimination, and technology neutrality. So these are explicitly mentioned. It does call in Article 10 for the adoption of enabling text. And I have to say that many of the countries that have adopted the framework agreement have adopted ancestral text, actually, basically all of them. And in particular, now they are adopting the Electronic Communications Convention, and even the accession, the ratification actually by the Philippines will come in this framework. That is to say, once a country becomes a party to the framework agreement, then has to do work, has to do an assessment using also the tools that Suyon has mentioned, and then of course identifies the need to complete its domestic legal framework and also to adopt the Electronic Communications Convention. So because of their features, the adoption of ancestral text is really critical to legally enable cross-border electronic exchanges. Now, this is my last slide. There are three ways in which these texts help. The first one is through legal harmonization. This is a process of approximation. If I know that, for instance, the electronic transactions law of the Maldives, which has just been adopted, is very similar to the Electronic Transactions Act of Sri Lanka, then I know that the legal effects of those electronic transactions will be the same regardless of the country where I could assess them, or even if need be litigate them, because there is a uniformity in the law that comes from the uniform source, and also the desirability to have uniform interpretation. If we move one step beyond, you have provisions like those in the model on electronic signatures and the one on electronic transfer record that deal explicitly with cross-border recognition and say explicitly that, for instance, reliability of the method should be assessed on geographic neutral basis. And that's one step beyond, and you will find more of those provisions in the model law on identity management and trust services. And then you have the ultimate solution, which is the Electronic Communications Convention, because that takes care of everything when it comes to B2B exchanges. Now, all the impact of this should not be underestimated, because as I said before, more than 100 states have already enacted ancillary tax on e-commerce one way or the other. So chances are that your country has already some legislation that helps in the giving legal recognition to cross-border electronic transactions. I would say also that there is a positive spillover effect from B2B to B2G and G2G. Traditionally, the focus of UNCITRAL is on B2B, but we see that UNCITRAL model laws are applied also in the public sector. So chances are that there could be solutions also in the public sector. And this is something that we will see now even more with the model law on identity management and trust services, because that one, especially the identity part, typically applies to public entities. And this concludes my presentation. I tried to as quick as I could to give some space to the Q&A, but not sure that I managed. Raul, back to you.
Thanks so much, Luca. Well, with the indulgence of our hosts, I may continue for 1 or 2 minutes to get a couple of questions in. The first question, I think, Rajan Sharma asks, how can paperless trade help address the liability transfer in cross-border trade? and gives as example, if Nepal wants to export via Bangladesh to Germany, there are many land borders that have to be passed through. And in particular, there's an issue with the Incoterms in respect of landlocked countries. So any thoughts on transfer of liability issues when it comes to paperless trade? I'll direct that first to you, Luca, if you wouldn't mind.
I think that we have to define which liability.
Right.
If a liability for, say, carriage of goods, that's defined in specific instruments. Although not all countries have adopted legislation on this, but there are treaties, some of them by UNCITRAL, for instance, for carriage of goods by sea. So that one can be clearly identified. If it is a liability, say, for non-conformity of goods, you have the UN Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods that can help a lot. I believe, the question needs a little bit of more specification. If it is a liability, for instance, for single windows operations, then the answer is completely different, and it depends on the arrangements behind the single windows that are directly relevant. So I would say liability is a big issue, is a complex issue. We have to break it down, but there are, in most cases, answers.
Thanks so much, Luca. The next question is for Ankur, and it's from Isra Ahmed, where they noted that we see in your presentation that electronic signatures are more or less enabled in many jurisdictions, but there isn't a harmonized approach necessarily to their treatment. Is there any plan to follow EIDAS or some other electronic signature law, or should there be? I know Luca might have some views on this, but first to Ankur, if you can. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd leave a lot of legal folks on this panel to probably better answer this question. From a practical operational standpoint, I find harmonization to be an extremely difficult concept. So if there is a mutual recognition, there's equivalence, there's acceptance, there are legal ways in which that can happen. I think that provides a good way to actually make implementation happen. But harmonization per se, or something where there is one single standard, it's a longer process. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be attempted and shouldn't be done for the different places. And I defer to Luca and the others who might have better answers on this. But from the perspective of implementation, what we tell often countries is that, look, what is the way in which we can make this work for you? It has to work from a legal standpoint, but how do we keep moving up, towards this, towards your implementation? So I think that plays a sort of a critical role. But yeah, I mean, from an optimal solution perspective, again, I'll defer to the legal folks on the panel. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Ankur. In the interest of time, I might jump to just one final question, and that's for Kay. It's from Alexei Bondarenko, and it is: the UK-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement will contribute. How will it contribute to cross-border paperless trade? And what are the other countries which Singapore would desire to sign such an agreement?
Hi, Raul. Thank you very much. And thank you, Alexei, for the question. The first question is a lot easier to answer than the second one. So in regards to the UK-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, what we've done is aligned with the UK on our common interests, and very specifically, we signed an MOU, between between MCI and DCMS, to look specifically at the electronic transferable electronic bills of lading, because I'm sure it's no surprise that UK is a very big maritime nation, very steeped in maritime tradition, and this is an area that is of immense interest to them, and us as well, of course. So in terms of contribution to cross-border paperless trade, I think if you look at how we align on a Melita adoption, it's really going to set the standard, I think, for much of the world's jurisdictions. And in terms of what other countries which Singapore will desire, well, we are, of course, being a very small nation, we look for willing and able partners to explore with us. And we are also present in, for example, we are a co-convener at the WTO, Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. So really, it's about finding countries with that common interest and common desire and working with them. Yeah, don't worry, you'll see many more such agreements being announced. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kay. I think that's a very diplomatic answer. I'm sure there's only so much you can say publicly. Well, thank you all for this wonderful panel. I'll pass it over quickly to Armin Manukian from UN ESCAP to conclude today. But from my perspective, it's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you all the panelists, and thank you for listening.
Hi, Lawrence.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thank you very much, Raul. It was great to have you. First of all, I would like just to say that without going too much into detail, I think all the questions related to the challenges for the information flow, data flow across the borders, data recognition, data maintenance, e-payments, certification, e-signatures, all those aspects have been mentioned by the different speakers.
Can I give you my wife's number? Because I'm actually in a meeting right
now. And I think that
I'm actually doing a presentation.
Mr. K, please can you
I'll give you the number.
Okay. So thank you very much. I would like first of all express my gratitude to Raul, because actually he's joining from New York and it's very late, actually early morning, maybe already there. I would like to express a big thank you to all participants that are trying to have time and sharing with us and participating and raising also all those questions. And of course, I would like to express my thank you to all the speakers and experts that have joined and contributed to this panel. I think the discussion is very interesting, but I see that there are areas that we can, as Luca mentioned, we can break down different aspects of these challenges and address them specifically. And I think from my perspective, there are some follow-ups that we can take with us, and also a follow-up webinar that we might organize on legal aspects. I think, of course, 1 hour, 30 minutes on webinar is not very much time to discuss all those aspects. And maybe we can discuss with the developing partners, international developing partners, with those areas that we have been highlighted by the speakers, and the challenges that can be directly replied by different standards and efforts by the international developing partners. And maybe we can organize a specific webinar on those aspects. So I hope to have your fruited cooperation also for the upcoming webinars. I would like to mention that we are confirming the next webinar on the 27th of July on data analytics for the cross-border paperless trade. And right now we are waiting for the confirmation for our Korean Customs Service to be the co-lead. And I will inform everyone through our event page and LinkedIn, everyone. Thank you very much for your time, and see you next.
Thanks, Armin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.